Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to talk again to Imam Tom. Welcome back, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah, Paul. It's always a pleasure. Happy to have another opportunity to speak together.
Yeah, it's a fantastic series. This is part 3 of the series of podcasts we'll be doing. So for those who don't know, the few are left in the world, Imam Tom Fukini converted to Islam in 2010, a year before he finished his BA in political science from Vassar College. He studied at the Islamic University of Medina, where he obtained his BA from the Faculty of Sharia. And he's currently the research director of Islam and Society at the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research. Also teaches tafsir and Islamic history online through Legacy International Online High School. And as you know, Tom has agreed very kindly to discuss the books that have made a significant difference to him intellectually. And we'll be continuing his discussion of the remarkable book, here we are, Restating Orientalism, a critique of modern knowledge by Wael Hallaq. Yes, you take the cover off your book. For some reason, I've left mine on, but yeah, indeed. And there's lots of praise for it on the back there. Published by Columbia University Press. If you don't have it, I do highly recommend it. And Hallaq, as I'm sure you know, professor in the humanities at Columbia University, where he's been teaching ethics, law, and political thought for some years now. He's considered a leading scholar in the field of Islamic legal studies and has been described as one of the world's leading authorities on Islamic law. So, without more ado, over to you, sir.
Okay, bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam rasulillah. Very honored and humbled, as always, to be with Blogging Theology. I consider it an immense privilege. And subhanAllah, Paul, every time we come together, and for the past few videos, there's been a couple months or a few months in between our videos, and the relevance and significance and the stakes of what we're talking about continue to escalate.
Yes.
Every single time.
Yes.
It was just this past week or so, I have a recent blog post that I wrote, sort of a short article for Yaqeen Institute's blog. I highly recommend everyone to read. It's called Intersectionality and Palestine Solidarity, Why Muslims Need to Lead the Gaza Protests. And it's essentially calling for Muslims to take up the leadership of this movement for Palestine and to wrestle it back from the hands of the leftists and the secular nationalists. Well, as you might imagine, that this stirred the pot a bit and created some strong reactions, especially in the online sphere, which for my own mental health, I'm not on social media anymore. However, people tell me things and they send me things. And there was a particular academic in Toronto, I believe, by the name of Ghada, who posted something of a tirade calling me, I'm speaking over Palestinian voices and I'm doing this and doing that, and basically accused the Yaqeen Institute of this and that. The third, Palestine is not an Islamic issue, it's not a Muslim issue, etc. What I was happy to see it, to be frank, happy to see it, because her line of critique is exactly what we're here to talk about today. And it's exactly what Hallaq, who is himself a Palestinian, utterly demolishes and critiques Saeed for, as we'll see at the end of today's.
By the way, just to pause, I mean, you mentioned this ferocious reaction, but this is testimony to how significant your work has become actually online, that people of that caliber feel that they need to respond in such detail. If you weren't a very significant voice now in online, then and elsewhere, then they wouldn't have bothered. They would have ignored you. So there is an indirect compliment there, I think.
Perhaps. Allah knows best. I just hope that Allah accepts it from us. The main line of her critique, which we're going to have to keep front and center in our minds, is, center Palestinian voices. You are marginalizing Palestinian voices, and I actually responded to the arguments in the last live stream that we did previous Wednesday, which I think is called some clickbaity title like "Leftist Hijacking," "Who Speaks for Palestine," something like that. But the essence of the retort is which Palestinians. Right? Like the Palestinians that happen to be even internally colonized by Western values and the Enlightenment, or the Palestinians who are actually adhering to Islamic values, many of whom, I'll put it out here up front because I know most people only watch the beginning of videos, many of whom have been exploiting, I will say the word, exploiting the Islamic resistance in Palestine, exploiting for their own gain, in the sense that many of the people in the West, the secularized, nationalist, leftist academics who speak about the martyrs, who speak about the resistance, who speak in such terms, are far, far, far away from the values and principles and deen of those same resistance fighters that they supposedly glorify, which is tantamount to an exploitation of them. So I'm shooting my shot. That's my shot. And I think by the end of the video today, you will see that such people, academics such as Ghada, represent the Edward Saids of the world. The people who have a very superficial critique of Western imperialism. Whereas there are other people such as Hallaq who understand the entire structure of knowledge which resulted in Western imperialism in the first place. However, by allowing themselves, or we don't have to say allowing, maybe that's not the right word, the fact of the matter is by having their subjectivities reconfigured in the Western model, they themselves are speaking from a position of epistemic, let's say, epistemicide. They are participating in an epistemicide, meaning that, yes, you might be Palestinian. Yes, you might be Indian or Pakistani. Yes, you might be from here or there or wherever else. However, if your episteme is from the Enlightenment, and if your episteme is from the colonizer, and you are now letting that go back to your homeland or your ancestral homeland and conquer it again and reform the subjectivities there, you actually, knowingly or unknowingly, have become conscripted in the colonial project.
Can I just briefly ask, can you just very succinctly define episteme for us? So those who haven't come across, is a very specialist term. It's very, very recent. I mean, I hadn't come across this word until about a year or two ago. So what does it actually mean?
It means a way of knowing the world. A way of knowing. An episteme or an epistemology is a way of knowing the world. And this becomes very significant because the DEI type diversity, right? The DEI, the diversity, equity, and inclusion logic will recruit all of the superficial diversity in the world. They will have people from every place of the world with every skin color, with every type of name, with every type of culture and dress, etc. However, it does not permit a diversity of values, a diversity of knowledges. And when that type of superficial diversity comes with guns and bombs, or with laws, or aid, or with university syllabi, or college classes, and actually exterminates other ways of looking at the world, other ways of knowing things in the world, more Islamic ways, and we'll get there, of knowing the world and being in the world and thinking through the world, then again, you yourself have become part of the problem. And you yourself are part of a different type of colonization, the internal colonization of either Muslim peoples, which you and I are particularly concerned about, but also non-elite Western people in general the world over. That's what's at stake for today's video. That's what's at stake in Hallaq's book. And you could argue many of his books, but particularly Restating Orientalism. Why does he care to point out Said? You have one Palestinian intellectual critiquing another Palestinian intellectual. It's not just for clout and jealousy. No, he cares because Said was limited by the ways in which he was constituted and internally colonized by the Western values and the Western way of knowing. And therefore, he wasn't able to really shed a light. He was sort of groping in the dark for why did colonization happen? Why did it happen in the way that it happened, at the time that it happened, from the people that it happened from, to the people that it happened to? Why? Said can't answer that question because of his commitments, because of his politics, For him, as we'll see, it comes down to representation, and Orientalism is just misrepresenting the Orient. That's why it comes down to now it's evolved into, or devolved into, identity politics. Oh, well, you're not Palestinian, you can't talk about Palestine. Those are the Sa'ids of the world, right? Whereas Hallaq and his likes are trying to get us to think about what are the ways of seeing in the world that predate the European Inquisition, or the European imposition on Palestine and the rest of the Muslim world, and who are the people now in the world that continue that tradition of knowledge, and who are the people who have given it up or have had it wrested from their hands by force. So, chapter 2, he titles it Knowledge, Power, and Sovereignty. Those are all very important words.
Yep.
Hallaq is going to be tackling all of these issues, and this is what's at stake. And I can't think of a time where it's more crucial, as we're jostling and grappling and jockeying for position and who speaks for Palestine. Indeed, who does speak for Palestine, right? Is it a secular nationalist leftist issue? Does the Palestine issue sit right next to queer liberation in the litany of leftist sort of passion projects? Or is it rather the waqf that Umar ibn al-Khattab made Palestine an endowment which cannot be sold or cannot be given up to anybody else, and therefore is an Islamic obligation to reconquer it under Muslim rule? Those are two completely different ways of looking at the world. Who gets to speak for Palestine, right? The nationalism that was a project of the European post-Enlightenment, or the Khilafah, or the Ummah, even if we don't want to talk about Khilafah, the Ummah. Which Palestine is it? Who gets to speak for Palestine? That is what is central in throughout Hallaq's work, and chapter 2 in particular. He starts by talking about what are some of the, if we were to describe Said's critique of Orientalism, what type of critique is it? How deep does it go? How far does it go? What are its merits? Because it's not a categorical thing. We're not here to just, tar and feather people and smear them. People have, contributions to make. And sometimes, not all the time, we'll get to that as well. Sometimes those contributions are cumulative. Sometimes people push the boulder a little bit uphill, and then another generation comes and pushes it a little bit further, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't point out the limitations of some critiques and some people, even if they have sort of cult followings. So Said's accomplishment, his type of critique when he's critiquing Orientalism, both in the work Orientalism and in Culture and Imperialism and his other works, is that he basically performed what we would describe as a postmodernist critique of Orientalism, or a postmodernist critique of Western knowledge, meaning that his primary critiques of Orientalism was that it was essentializing and it was universalist. You should be, anybody who's in higher ed should be very familiar with those terms at this point. They've been very popularized. It's essentially a postmodern critique that, if you go with the modernist sort of worldview, the one that's less distanced from the Enlightenment, and I won't say that it's necessarily counter, it's more of a reform movement into Enlightenment thinking. The Enlightenment modernist sort of discourse assumes, and we'll see that again as well later in this video, that these things are universal, that European knowledge is universal, that there are essences, very fixed essences. The Africans are like this, and the Indians are like that, and
the Arabs are like this. They are a type, an essence. This is now, as we see, is very racist, of course, and rightly so. But yeah, it's essentialist. Yeah.
Yes, and there's a hilarious meme, one of my favorite memes on the internet, about the difference between academics today versus academics in the 1700s. Whereas the academics today are like, after 20 years, here's my life's work, peer-reviewed, multiple readers, like etc. Forgive me for any mistakes. And they're kind of humbly submitting their work over. Whereas the 1700s thinker is like, this just occurred to me in the bathtub, and it is essential truth with a capital T for all people of all times. Right? It's something that gets at the bold and sweeping sort of nature of the positivist claims of especially that very close to the Enlightenment style of thinking. So
I love how each succeeding philosopher, be it John Locke or Jeremy Bentham or James, all of them, or even Descartes earlier, all of them founded knowledge, philosophy, ethics, epistemology on a new basis, and each of them for the world. And of course, every single one was different, and each one was founding it again and again and again. So you had all these new, unique foundations going on. Kant as well, and of course, after a while, it gets a bit tiresome because you can't have all these new foundations. But yeah, they were all universalist, unqualified for humanity. But all the, of course, white Western Europeans saying all this.
Yes, and we will get to that. That's another irony of some of the leftists, is that many of the leftists, they style themselves as anti-Western, anti-imperialist. However, ultimately, their thought and philosophy and worldview is derived from these same dead white guys, these same dead Europeans, or 1 degree removed, but we'll talk about that. So essentially, Said's critique of Orientalism is a postmodernist critique. He's not critiquing it from an Islamic perspective. He's not critiquing it from a subaltern perspective. He's not critiquing it from an episteme or a way of knowing the world that sits outside of European modernity, right? He's actually critiquing it from within European modernity. And his critique is postmodern in the sense that his big gripe is that, wait a second, these things aren't actually universal truths. They're more relativist, right? And they're not essentialist. That there's a lot more sort of fluidity and blobification, if you will, than the sort of bold sweeping claims. So people should just not make such bold sweeping claims, which is, again, gets back to his sort of representationalist sort of take about what Orientalism is. It's just Westerners misrepresenting the Orient, which is the if we're going to put in very, very brief terms, Said's critique of Orientalism. So it's meant to, that you can see how it lends itself to an identity politics where he's basically trying to say, hey, Westerners, stop writing about the East. Because whether you write something negative or positive, and we talked about this in the previous chapters, it doesn't matter whether it's negative or positive. The fact that you're a Westerner talking about the East makes it problematic. You're misrepresenting, and therefore you should stop, which is exactly the retort. Whereas why is an American racialized as white convert speaking for Palestine or speaking about Palestine? You should just stop. It's not your issue, right? That's the Saidian critique. Hallaq says that this type of critique, the postmodern critique, is a tool of the central domain. It does not stand outside of the central domain of modernity or of European thought or of the Enlightenment thought. It's not a paradigmatic critique, right? It doesn't critique Western knowledge as such, or what led to Orientalism. It only critiques this one tiny corner of it. And what he calls is turning Orientalism into politics. And he means something very specific by that. And we'll explain and unpack what he means by politics later. But rather than seeing Orientalism as a function of knowledge, Said sees it as a function of politics, meaning there's actors, they come, and they're trying to represent something, and they're misrepresenting something, and this is bad. Not that there's no descriptive power to that, but it really is almost criminal negligence when it comes to what else is going on. And that, I think, is fairly, it fairly summarizes Hallaq's point of view. So what he says is that rather Orientalism is not merely representational, and this goes back to where we left off last video. It is performative in the philosophical lingo. Performative, not in the sense of performance like we're actors on a stage, performative in the philosophical sense that it actually creates reality. It doesn't just represent and describe reality, it creates reality. That Orientalism is not merely a Westerner coming along and misrepresenting the Orient. It is actually an act of structuring genocide. Okay? Orientalism is actually an act of structuring colonization, of structuring social and cultural engineering, where you are taking away from people their entire way of viewing the world and thinking about the world and seeing the world and replacing it with something else. That is what Orientalism is and does, and it's actually much broader than just Orientalism. It's actually the whole structure of Western knowledge. Orientalism is just the most sort of off-key or visibly sort of repugnant element of it, right? It's like if you have something, if you go, you read something from 100 years ago or 200 years ago, and there are certain things that might be problematic about it, but they make one really off-color comment that really sticks out. Orientalism is that one off-color comment that really sticks out, where there's other things that are just as problematic that are going on. In the entire structure of Western knowledge, Orientalism is simply a symptom of it and not the cause. Hallaq says, Said's conception of Orientalism leaves some questions unanswered. Why Europe in particular? Why did Europe's Orientalism sort of hide these differences specifically? Why did Orientalism occur at all? Is it something that is completely unique or not? And Hallaq does a good job of actually pulling quotes from Said to show that Said's critique of Orientalism is somewhat incoherent. And we talked about this again. This is sort of bridging the gap between last chapter and this chapter. And we talked about the where of Orientalism and the when of Orientalism. Said is somewhat confused. Is Orientalism specifically a European modern phenomenon, or is it something that goes back to the Greeks? Is Dar al-Hikmah or Bayt al-Hikmah, like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, is that an act of Orientalism? Is Ibn Khaldun involved in Orientalism? Or is Orientalism specific to the imperial projects of modern Europe? Said he has language that you could justify either, but Hallaq says that his general thrust, if you take his total body of works, he seems to indicate that Orientalism is something that anybody could do at any time with any people, that it's not distinctively modern and it's not distinctively European, okay? Which is why then it lends itself very easily to identity politics, because it's now just that, well, it happens that Europeans are now sort of hegemonic, and it happens that, and therefore there's asymmetry of power, and because it's this group that's misrepresenting this other group, and plus the asymmetry of power, results in the fact that it's so problematic and violent and harmful, to use the language of DEI and these sort of college campuses. This is really beating around the bush. It's not really cutting at the heart. And Hallaq has some provocative questions to probe Said's sort of understanding of Orientalism. How does Said, he says, I skipped something. Why Orientalism in particular? Why not sociology? Why not anthropology? Why not political science? Why not economics? Again, Said is basically just painting this little corner of European modern knowledge and saying this is what's problematic.
If I remember seeing an interview with Wael Hallaq, he says that in most areas of knowledge, most epistemologies, one can advance his critique. And I think there were one or two exceptions, like classical music or art or something. I forget, there was like 2 or 3 topics that he thought were actually not actually involved in this critique that he's advancing. But all other areas of knowledge, academically and other disciplines, are actually open to his critique, actually.
That's interesting. I'll have to bring that up with him when he comes back to the because
I don't quite know that. It was that interview he did in Doha with Professor Lombard, and he mentioned that his critique was read to all fields of knowledge apart from just 1 or 2, and I think he mentioned art and music, but I would need to double check.
For someone who used to be a classically trained musician, I would beg to differ. That there are definitely examples, and
maybe you should bring it up with him.
That's a good excuse to meet over coffee. So, but that's his point, is that Hallaq is saying, Said is singling out Orientalism, but the entire structure of knowledge is just as problematic, right? So why focus on Orientalism at the expense of anthropology? Look at what anthropology was doing like 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago. The way that they, describe human beings as part of the landscape, as brute animals that need civilization, right? And he's going to get into how it structures the colonial project, right? Why focus on just Orientalism? Why not focus on anthropology? Why not focus on economics, right? What models are for development, and which ones are backwards, and which ones need? Now that justifies a power intervention, doesn't it? And we see that. We see it even today with the IMF. If you don't have a specific sort of regimen, if you don't want to open yourself up to free trade, you don't want to open yourself up to global markets, what's going to happen? The British are going to invade you in the case of China with the Opium Wars and force you to join the market. Right? That different economic knowledges do also play a role in this as well, right? So why not focus on those? Why not focus on sociology? It basically, if there's a forest fire, Sa'id is asking us to look at one tree. Like the whole forest is on fire. And you're telling us to look at this one particular tree. Yes, this tree is also burning. But look at the entire thing. And Orientalism is almost easier critique because, again, it's that really off-color comment, the one that everybody in polite society would not accept, right? As opposed to things that still deserve esteem today and respect.
Well, you could say, I mean, to defend Ibn Said a little bit here, I mean, what he did was seminal in that he initiated a way of thinking that began the process of critiquing the Western paradigm, the Western epistemology, when it was looking at other cultures, at the other. So although I love your analogy with the forest fire, you know, it was selective and narrow, but nevertheless it began something that later thinkers like Wael Hallaq obviously are truly making global in their vision, encompassing vision.
There's merit to that, though also problems with that, because yes, Sa'id does begin the critique, and I think, as we said in a previous video, he made visible something that previously was invisible.
Exactly.
And he definitely deserves credit for that, 100%.
That's my point. Yeah.
However, he didn't merely render something visible. He also had sort of a prescription for how to deal with it. And his prescription ended up being a big dead end for how to deal with the entire structure. So if we're going to go with the forest fire analogy, Sa'id directs our attention to one particular tree and tells us to throw, I don't know, gasoline on it. Or something that's not really going to solve the issue. Or maybe his idea is to cut a branch off to save it from burning. Or there's like one, like whatever it is. He directed our attention to it in new ways, which obviously is extremely important. And even, you know, Hallaq himself describes in the intro him as hijacking and commandeering Sa'id's ship and taking it to a better destination, right? Definitely. But Hallaq also says that the nature of Sa'id's critique has created so much obfuscation around the structure of Western knowledge that it's made it harder to critique in that sense. That we've had this vague sense since the 70s when Sa'id was, you know, like really becoming sort of popular and seminal. We've had this feeling, yes, this is wrong, and sort of Orientalism is wrong, and the, you know, violence and imperialism against other cultures is wrong. But since the 70s, how sharp has our critique gotten of it? 50 years has gone by, and it's basically still been a very fuzzy critique. These questions that Hallaq is asking in when did he write the book? 2023, still remain sort of off most people's radar and completely sort of like stupefying. Now, you go to the average person who understands themselves as a decolonial sort of thinker in the Western Academy and say, why Orientalism and why not sociology? That would probably stump a lot of people. If we ask in his next question, how does Sa'id explain the absence of anything like Orientalism in Islam or in China or in India? Why didn't India have an Orientalism? Why didn't ancient China have anything similar at all approaching the scale of Orientalist scholarship? Departments, area studies, right? Going on the ground, producing new law. We don't have it. It doesn't exist. We didn't have in any ancient civilization, in any pre-modern, not even ancient, in any pre-modern civilization, Islam included, we do not have a parallel to the phenomenon of Orientalism and Orientalist scholars, and even Western knowledge entirely. You don't have people who are Europeanists within, you know,
or Occidentalists, to give it.
Or Occidentalists, right? That are going to go do field work and sit in on a classroom in Oxford and, oh wow, very interesting. Yeah, this is fascinating. Look at how the natives do this. Look how the natives do that.
Look how the Englishman eats his baked beans on toast. This is interesting how he opens the can and pours it in the thing and heats it up. And this is a very interesting culinary practice. What does this tell us about the essential English character for lack of taste in food or
exactly.
some such nonsense?
How primitive of them, right? No, but this is exactly the Hallaq's question. Why not? And the answer, if we're going to just like fast forward, but we'll unpack it. The answer is that this type of knowledge was built for domination and subjugation. The Western knowledge was not a knowledge without a purpose. No, the opposite. The knowledge was vested with a purpose and a reason to exist, and the reason to exist was subjugation and domination. Yep. The Islamic civilizations and the other civilizations, they conquered, of course, 100%. They conquered. One could say dominated. He'll get into that language later. But they didn't have it didn't occur to them that they would want to completely hollow out people from the inside out, replace their subjectivities, obliterate their culture, eviscerate their ways of thinking about the world. Never occurred to any civilization in history before modern Europe.
The paradigmatic example of that, of course, is the French, when Napoleon went to Egypt, for example, and with an army of academics to study the natives and write about their language, their habits, their customs. And talk about eviscerating, hollowing out. We see this, the French in Algeria. Algeria was not a colony. It was part of France. And the natives were told to become French. In other words, to stop speaking Arabic, to women stop wearing hijab and so on. So even the British didn't go that far in the British Empire. But yeah, Islamically, of course, yes, the Muslims conquered, but they actually respected the otherness of the Christian culture, the Jewish culture, and so on. And they were permitted to carry on, basically, according to their own cultural norms. Something the French, who are the kind of the bête noire, was never permitted their subjects to do.
Absolutely. Their otherness, because some people, especially in the post-colonial and decolonial spaces, they have come to the conclusion that it was the otherness within European thinking that led to violence, and therefore they bristle at every other sort of intellectual enterprise, even such as Islam, who also identifies others. The other for the Muslim is the kafir, or even the mushrik, right? Now, with a European baggage, with European experience, that makes the decolonial and post-colonial thinker uneasy, because they assume that now that requires violence, right? But what we're saying is that the otherness that other societies and other civilizations did sort of partake in never resulted in the type of violence that the European otherness did. And so is it really simply, and we talked about this in the previous video about he has this sort of fourfold model, proximity and distance. Said's assumption is that distance and othering necessitates violence. And we look at history and say, no, it doesn't. Lots of civilizations have come and gone who have had others, who have had distance, who have even had stereotypes, and let's even say bigotry towards other groups. And that didn't result in genocide. And it didn't result in epistemicide. It didn't result in a wiping out their way of knowing the world. So what gives? What is it about Europe and European colonization and modern colonization that is different, unique, that made that sort of happen? That's what Hallaq is driving at. He says it's the structure of knowledge entirely. He quotes Said saying that that European Orientalism isn't, in fact, unique, that it was done by every power and every sort of advanced culture. So again, Said kind of waffles. He does say at one point that Orientalism is a Western style of domination, but then he contradicts himself with much more language that indicates an explicit language saying that Orientalism is something that is not unique, that is every advanced culture has participated in it. He goes back to ancient Greece. He conflates it with bigotry. He conflates it with all these sorts of other sort of more innocent things. And there's reasons for that, and we'll talk about that. In a bit. Hallaq says this is ahistorical. And it doesn't even make sense when it comes to the coherence of his argument. Why then single out Western Orientalism for critique? If Orientalism existed in ancient Greece, why not critique the Orientalism of ancient Greece? If Orientalism or something like it existed in ancient China, then why single out European modern Orientalism for critique? Why aren't we critiquing all these other Orientalisms at the same time? They didn't exist. That's why. Why not point to other examples, which he doesn't, because they don't exist? And to make a qualitative distinction, which he doesn't, Said's basic argument is that the only thing that distinguishes these is a quantitative distinction. That, well, modern European Orientalism, it does it a lot more, and a lot more ubiquitously, which again misunderstands the structure of knowledge that we're talking about here. Hallaq says rather, Orientalism is merely a symptom of modern knowledge. It is not the cause, it is the symptom. And a particular type of knowing the world that is based on power, and a specific definition of that, we'll get into it, that this is unique. It is qualitatively different to everything that came before. It has a singular structure that is discernible from other structures of knowledge or other ways of knowing the world that we still have today. Islam is a structure of knowledge. among other things. It's a way of knowing the world. We can look at it. We can go into the books. We can study it. And it is very, very qualitatively different than the Western Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment way of knowing the world. So let's see here. Okay, yes. There's two comparative case studies that Hallaq brings up to sort of indicate his point, and things that Said misses that, if he had addressed them, perhaps would have led him to sort of revise his thesis. One is education, right? And the way that education has shifted throughout history, going from what was about moral instruction, producing a moral subject, to one that is now focused on producing a citizen. This is something that it is a type of project of building a type of subject that is predisposed towards certain actions. And as Hallaq will go on to say, and we'll say in a bit, it's training Orientalists to do their work, right? It's training the Orientalists to deploy them to do the work of structuring the colonization and structuring the genocide and structuring whatever. You can't have, or like Said's account of Orientalism makes it seem like they just like pop out of nowhere and it's their own sort of prejudice and whatever. Where's the academy? Where's the university at? Where are the disciplines of knowledge at in this formation of these subjects who are now doing this work? This is an entire factory. This is an entire institution and a blueprint for how to produce subjects that are now going to colonize and conquer and dominate and subjugate in a particular style. The second sort of case study that has to be reckoned with is that of law. And this is something that unfortunately Said completely glosses over, what Hallaq calls the juridicality of modern knowledge. Modern knowledge is not just about representation. It's not just about making an offensive movie about some Eastern people or some offensive book, even though there's plenty of that.
Just on that point, I mean, this is a kind of an Orientalist point. I was just watching Netflix. I know, disclaimer, I shouldn't mention this publicly, but someone tweeted about it. They tweeted about this new series that's just started on Netflix and produced by an American company, and some of it's in Arabic, and they actually put subtitles on the Netflix so you can in English, so you can follow the Arabic bit when Arabs are talking, and it actually says terrorist speaking at this point. This is a guy actually says terrorist speaking. Unbelievable. I read this on Twitter. I thought that can't be true. So I looked on Netflix and played it, and it actually is true. So it's still a very old 1980s tropes of Arabs being terrorists. Is there in Netflix series. It's just being produced now. I know it's a trivial point, but some things haven't changed, and this is Netflix, the #1 global, on streaming, series that you can watch.
No, it is a significant point. That's not. I mean, I read about a certain series that came out. I'm very ignorant of pop culture, but I think is it Jessica Alba or some famous actress or something like this, if I'm not mistaken, in some sort of either movie or series that was also streamed, and that now get this. One of the scenes depicted them pretending to deliver aid into, I think it's Syria, and then these masked Arab terrorists are basically, fighting against them and intercepting an aid truck. And even people today, thankfully in the last 9 months have been sort of woken up to point out how problematic this is. It's like you're depicting the Arabs here, or the Muslims. Let's be frank, it's not just Arabs, it's also Muslims specifically. And this was part of my blog post when I was talking about the indispensability of the Islamic dimension of Palestinian advocacy, is that when Zionists go to Western governments to ask for money and ask for weapons, they do not ask for help to fight Arab terrorism. They ask for help to fight Islamic terrorism. They ask for help to fight Islamic fundamentalism. There's plenty of receipts. There's plenty of quotes going back to the 90s of Israeli heads of state, quote unquote, occupier state, fake state, phony state, but, figureheads using specifically the language of Islamic fundamentalism, Islamic terrorism, and you won't see them talk about fighting Arab terrorism. So it's not just about the racialization, though that's part of it. It's also about sort of the securitization of Muslims. Anyway, people found it so insensitive because people didn't necessarily take it to its full conclusion, but they realized, like, wait a second, you're doing this now, and it's this type of person who looks like this, who is the victim, and this type of person who looks like that, who's the supposed perpetrator. But the reality in occupied Palestine right now is the opposite, right? It's the Israelis who are blocking the aid from coming in to Gaza. It's the Israelis who are intercepting aid trucks or sneaking into the country or sneaking into Gaza.
And this is not a conspiracy theory. I'll say that the United Nations agency have complained loudly about this. This is the facts on the ground that have been noticed by independent observers that the state of Israel is blocking aid to a population that's already under unbelievable stress. Yeah,
it's very well documented. But the point that most people won't put together, but hopefully they will, because it's just a stone's throw away, it's the next degree, is that movies like that and series like that are not just descriptive, they are performative. They structure your reality. They make the Muslim and the Arab more subjugatable. Every single series that comes out like that makes the Muslim lives more dispensable. Cost a little bit less. You'll shed one less tear when you see the hooded or turbaned Arab Muslim guy get blown to bits by a quadcopter or something else from remote control, right? These things have performative functions within society. They are meant to structure genocides. They are meant to structure genocides. And that is the soft power, sort of dimension of how these things work. So that is, absolutely 100%. This is still very much going on. And the same thing with the academia, which we'll talk about. He has a special sort of section on the academy and the types of knowledge that it produces and how those knowledges, whether it's political science, economics, anthropology, sociology, whatever it is, AI, right, directly go into the subjugation and violence against certain types of populations. But one thing that most people sleep on is law and the juridicality of modern knowledge, that everywhere you go, and he's got a great, towards the end of chapter 2, he divides it into part 1 and part 2. If you want to just skip to the stuff that has to do with the Muslim world and the colonization of the Muslim world, skip right to part 2 of chapter 2. It's like only 20 pages, but he goes through the Dutch and the British and the French and like how the juridical dimension of colonization is underemphasized, that the restructuring of Muslim life and even Islam itself, right, through the creation of institutions, the creation of law, the busting up of waqfs and land, and the creation of LLCs, the introduction of different types of laws. This is all part of the colonial project. It's all unprecedented. We don't have it. Like when the Muslims conquered, they didn't come to North Africa, they didn't come to Persia and employ a bunch of Orientalist or Occidentalist scholars to come up with laws within their traditions, right? Or trying to sort of eliminate their subjectivities or their ways of viewing the world. Yeah, there was da'wah. There's an invitation to us now. If you want to become Muslim, welcome. But nothing approaching the European project of knowledge, which has a sort of sovereignty of law that sort of imposes itself, colonizes the mind. Why do they always have on every classroom the political map of the world, right? With every nation state. That's the only map they want you to think through, right? Like those are the nation states. You get the assumption that the United Kingdom has right over every inch of this territory. The United States has jurisprudence and jurisdiction over every inch of this territory. They're teaching you to think through the nation state as opposed to other types of maps, right? This is something where the laws and the knowledge all sort of produce a certain type of subjectivity. So historically, things went from moral knowledge to subjugate. That's Hallaq's one of his main points. Knowledge before modernity, before the Enlightenment, was moral knowledge. People were concerned about doing the right thing, whether it was objectively true or not, because obviously people were worshiping false gods from an Islamic perspective. Obviously, people were worshiping false gods, etc. But hermeneutically, within their own sort of worldview, it was geared towards doing the right thing.
Yeah,
right?
well, we see this influence of Aristotle and Plato on moral theology and ethics in the medieval period, the period of the scholasticism. It wasn't this separate kind of pseudo-scientific category of ethics. No, it was orientated to, or as a teleology towards virtue and
Yes.
good living and so on, whatever the metaphysical concomitants of that were. But yes, you're absolutely right. It's a very moral framework. Yeah.
Yes, so that's one of the main differences, diagnostic differences between the pre-modern and the modern world. Knowledge goes from primarily being concerned about morality and good living the good life, or being a good person, virtue, to having knowledge of, or knowledge as a function of subjugation, right? That there is, as Hallaq says, within the modern era, there is no knowledge without domination, that it is implanted into the very structure of knowledge. You know in order to subjugate. Now, he goes through a little bit of sort of history as to why this is true. We'll take a brief detour and try to hustle through this, I think, because it's not necessarily central to where we're going, but it is interesting, where he talks about the rise of the modern state and also the idea of domination over nature. And he talks about the domination over nature as a structure of modern knowing and not just an event. Like, this is why secular, and we've talked about this on your program before, why secular environmentalism will never, ever work. It will never work, because it takes the domination of nature as an event. The domination of nature is not an event. It's an entire structure of knowing. It's the whole thing that the modern world is doing. Like, you have to get into our definitions of human beings, our idea of self, our idea of nature, our idea of the interaction between the two. Now, Hallaq does trace back, and Talal al-Asad does this as well, where he said that there are certain seeds that existed within Christianity that eventually become unhinged and unbound after secularism, in secular modernity, where basically they become almost like cancerous tumors, where they go malignant, right? So some of the seeds that he points to, right? One, he talks about the Genesis, the story of the fall, the idea of sort of, man's fall from grace as being one that is dominated and characterized by shame, and coming into a world that is supposed to run by itself. And so he has a really interesting quote where he says, within the Christian worldview, both labor and nakedness and death all represent moral faults, right? Because they're all tied in with that sort of original sin doctrine. And this becomes something
and pain in pregnancy, actually, that a woman suffers in labor is actually a moral fault, because this is a part of the judgment given on her. Yes, so even that is part of the moral fault of a woman, according to Jesus.
So the most natural, beautiful thing in the world, right? Pregnancy and childbirth is now considered like a moral stain within the Christian universe, under the ideology of sort of what happened with the fall. Now, Hallaq's argument, and again, he cites somebody else, I think Paul Kuhn. I'm not familiar with him. I'm more familiar with Talal al-Asad, but Talal al-Asad makes similar points about these sorts of seeds within Christianity that once we cross over modernity, and once the limits that Christianity had imposed on European knowledge that kept it within the realm of the moral, right? Once those limits are removed, that this basically paves the way for an exploitative relationship, not just relationship, an exploitative theology and ontology of what nature is. That nature is there to be dominated. Nature is there. That's what it is. Like, our relationship to nature is necessarily one of domination. And this is, he goes into, let's see here. So one of the points, again, because some people will try to throw Christianity under the bus entirely. So this is one thing that he anticipates, because sometimes when you bring up the thing Christianity, especially in more leftist circles, they'll say, well, this is just Christian patriarchy and Christian domination of nature. Hallaq hits back a little bit. It's like, let's be fair. Why didn't Christianity exterminate before modernity? In the sense that it did. Yes, it had Inquisition, 100%. Yes, it had other sorts of things. There was a propensity to violence. Even when he says that there were 4 main genocides that sort of characterize Europe, and he says the first is the genocide of Muslims and Jews in Spain. The second are Native Americans. The 3, when it comes to the colonization of Africa and the North Atlantic slave trade. And 4, actually, he says, European witches. Those are the 4 sort of like genocides of Europe. But he says even these were limited in scope and in quality before modernity unleashed the true violent potential of what human beings could do. And you'll actually find this if you go to the way that slavery, chattel slavery, was sort of theorized. It becomes legalized as strictly racial, not after the fact, but later on. The initial sort of bringing of slaves to North America in the 1500s and the 1600s, a lot of people, they say like the 1619 Project. We were just at a Juneteenth event last night with some of the African American, community leaders that were presenting on the history of Islam in America. Tons of fascinating stuff there. Islam goes back in America way before most people realize.
Yeah, this is very true. Yeah.
Slavery goes back way before people realize. There was on the left, they had the 1619 Project, which is supposedly the first sort of group of slaves that were brought to the New World. And they said, that's not true. There were slaves that were being brought in the 1520s. Actually, some of the crew of Columbus were Moors from Morocco, were Muslims. And they were given Spanish names and stuff like that. So there's a lot of details that don't make it into the narratives. But the point is that the juridicality and the legalization and the racialization of slavery all happen closer to the turn of true modernity, which Hallaq has a definition of modernity that's later than what most people would say, where you're getting into the 1700s and definitely the 1800s, as opposed to like the 1600s and the 1500s. Well, Hallaq would not consider that modernity. That in the 1500s and 1600s, you had slaves of all different ethnicities that were coming to North America, and then in the late 1600s and in the 1700s, the law itself, the juridical tool of modernity, legalizes and racializes and cements that practice of chattel slavery as specifically a racial thing. And this is where now whites can't be enslaved, right? And now like you have these very sort of distinct categories. So that to say that there are certain things, yes, there are predecessors or there are certain things within Christianity itself that contributed to the genocidal logic of modernity, but they weren't responsible in and of themselves. They weren't possible without the shifts that European society would undergo with secularization at the turn of modernity, where now the limits that God had imposed, and that's not to excuse at all the sort of barbarity of what was done under sort of older forms of Christianity, but even those barbarities were amplified exponentially by untethering them from any moral language. The introduction of the distinction between is and ought, the common theme in Hallaq's works, the idea that we can separate fact and value, that there is such a thing as just, objective facts, and then what we should do about them is something else entirely.
About the person who sees the father of modern liberalism, John Locke, of course, the English philosopher, very influential on the American Constitution, where he's cited or paraphrased. His liberalism, as far as he saw it, was perfectly compatible with his personal financial investment in the slave trade during Elizabeth I's time. So he saw them as quite compatible, slavery and liberalism.
I mean, I would even be more provocative and say that was his liberalism. And I think that the leftists of today need to seriously reckon with that. Let me also say this. I notice, and I don't read the comments too much, but once in a while I look at the comments, and if you want to provoke a leftist, you conflate them with liberals because they don't think that they're liberals. They actually, bristle at that quite a bit. They think that they're very radically different from liberals. And when I do that, that's actually an intentional dig. I'm sorry to say, I am that petty. I think that I am saying that you're not as different from liberals as you think you are. That if you're a leftist, if you're a Marxist, if you're an anarchist, and I used to be a Marxist and an anarchist, I've read those works and I'm very, very familiar with Marxist theory and anarchist theory and leftist theory. You're not that different from liberals. You think you are, but you're not.
The same spectrum, really. I mean, it's not that different, actually. There are similar kind of like assumptions about man, about God, the absence of God, and so on. There is a family likeness, a very strong family likeness.
It's a reform movement within liberalism, within philosophical liberalism. It's not something that, as much as they pride themselves on being radical, they're not a radical departure from Enlightenment values whatsoever. And that's why even if you go later, I know, like, forget your Judith Butlers and Bell Hooks and Audre Lordes and all the queer theory in the world and everything that you study now, those are all ideas about body and bodily autonomy and subjectivity that you can go right back to Locke. And Absolutely. You can go right. So, I mean, now you can put a DEI lens on it and say that, well, no, I only read queer, black, theorists, whatever. All their ideas are, if not identical, then simply 1 or 2 degrees removed from Enlightenment values, the same dead white European guys that you guys really don't like, right? So if you want something really radically different from the Enlightenment, come to Islam and see what see what Islam has to offer, because that is what a radical critique of Enlightenment values.
I came to the same conclusion as you a long time ago, that Islam is the genuine alternative to modernity. The rest are just variations on a theme within the same paradigm. They may look different and smell different and have different colors attached to their labels, but really they are rooted in the same epistemology, the same ontology, same metaphysics, of course. Absolutely, they're all secular. But no, Islam is the only true alternative. Even Christianity, I regret to say, is now largely a species of secular humanism. If you look at all the Pope's comments and so on, they're very warm and fuzzy and don't really offend the Guardian leader writers or the New York Post, New York Times rather, who love him. And there's the reason they love him, because he's on the same wavelength as them. But if you get a strong Muslim voice, that would never be received in the same way. It would be too radical. Anyway.
So Hallaq's whole point here with taking his detour to talk about Christianity and the seeds of Christianity is that what he wants to say, and he does say it, that there were inklings of this sort of logic before, but they didn't crystallize into a distinct system of thoughts until modernity, right? There was racism, there was genocide, there were other things that were going on, but genocide as a system of thought really is a modern phenomenon, and it is unique. Why does Hallaq care about proving it to be something unique? That's one of the main pillars of his critique of Sa'id, that Sa'id does not consider Orientalism or modernity as something unique. He basically has this very, I think, probably the dominant and the common attitude that these things are incidental, that it just happens to be Europe. That if anybody, he's going to get into this in just a second, that if it happened to be anybody else, if the Chinese had gotten the technology first, that they would have colonized the world and done the same thing, that it just happens to be Europe. Hallaq said no, that this is structurally part of their way of knowing the world that was unleashed by the secular Enlightenment, and that this is what is responsible for the genocides as a system of thought. Now, Hallaq is going to now move on to try to take away the other sort of counter-arguments or obstacles that Sa'id or other people like him would have had to sort of reaching this conclusion. So he already sort of addressed some of them. One of them is sort of what he calls the theology of progress. That this is a major obstacle for a lot of people to believe that modern secular violence is qualitatively different from anything that came before, or that the European colonization of the world, modernity on, 1800s on, is qualitatively different than any other type of domination before. A lot of what's holding people back, or what's holding a lot of people back, I should say, is the theory of progress. This idea that that human knowledge is cumulative, even across cultures, that we're all sort of participating in just like building and building and building and building, that this idea functions to distribute the destructiveness across both sides of modernity. So we say that's where you get sort of the cop-outs. Well, the Chinese also colonized. Well, Muslims also colonized Africa, right? You get these sort of blobification of terms where now we're saying colonized, but we're really talking about two very different types of practices.
Yes.
But we're going to use the same word to describe them. Yeah. Imperialism,
because conquest, mere conquest, is not the same as French colonization, which, as you say, was a hollowing out of a people, a culture from their faith, their language, and it's very, very different. The Islamic conquest were not like that at all.
Exactly, very much. And Richard Bullitt has work, and other academics have done great work to demonstrate this factually. The second tool of the theory of progress, so the first tool is sort of distributing destructiveness, right? The second tool is exaggerating pre-modern problems, right? Life was nasty, Brutus, and short, and everybody was keeling over and dying.
The Dark Ages was an era, a terrible time of suffering and death. Nothing ever happened. There was no culture, which is extreme, but it's false as a statement. But I mean, But a lot was going on, and there's been a reaction against that characterization of this period of the Dark Ages in Europe as largely false.
Yes, in Europe or outside of Europe. One of the things that I find it interesting, and this is part of the importance of having sort of a grounding in pre-modern knowledge, especially in the Islamic tradition. If you're familiar with the biographies of the companions, you have to confront pretty quickly that they lived just as long as we do, right? Even though they were living in 7th century Arabia, they weren't dying at 30, like the modern thesis, the modernization thesis sort of purports. That, before modern medicine, the average life expectancy when people were dying of childbirth, and not to say that these things didn't happen at all, but did they happen at a greater prevalence than today? Abu Hurairah lived past 100, right? There were other...
I think infant mortality was much greater, but once people survived that initial threat, that danger, then they went on very often to live to similar age spans as we do today.
And we even have the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ who says that the average life expectancy of the people of my ummah will be in the 60s. Right? That's not a whole lot different from many nations today. Right? So there's an exaggeration of pre-modern problems that sort of is done as apologia. This is all modernist apologia. People who believe in the theology of progress, they always sort of resort to these sorts of tactics. And anything that you bring up, whether it's Hitler, whether it's nuclear bombs, whether it's man-made destruction, that's what Hallaq calls a paradigm of exceptions. All of them, those sorts of phenomena get described as exceptions to the rule and not actually the rule, right?
Well, so Hitler was a great natural set. They're great believers in progress, technological progress. They weren't backward in the sense of wanting to throw out machinery and technology. They were involved, they had weaponry and the nuclear bomb. They were working on that. They were passionately concerned with progress in that limited sense.
100%, right? So these are the sort of three pillars of the theology of progress, and this is a major impediment to a lot of people realizing the unique nature of both modern secular knowledge and the violence that it structures. And Said included. Said also fell prey to that, this sort of idea that we're all developing and there's development and, modernizing and things like that. Where in the modern era, Hallaq says that all knowledge proceeds from domination. And he goes through some terms. Well, we'll go through some history, then we'll go through the terms because he kind of deliberates on what we should call it, right? Because all of these terms, such as conquest and domination, right, they can signify many different things in a variety of practices. Mm-hmm. What's the best way of describing the qualitative difference of what we're living in now to what came before it? He says about how reason became unbound from morality, therefore reason became instrumental. That's along right with the Enlightenment. Natural rights were the same as a will to dominate, the supposedly obvious self-evident natural rights that the Enlightenment philosophers articulated were really sort of a will to dominate, right? It's like I have the right over this and the right over that, and therefore I get to do with it what I want. Even like we have Kant in the categorical imperative, right? Shifts reason and duty from either public or divine to being located within the self, right? It's like my reason happens within myself, my morality happens within myself, my freedom happens within myself. Sort of the is-ought distinction that we've talked about so much culminates in the justification for the domination of nature and the self. This gets into now, has played out into transgenderism, where we have, or homosexuality, quote unquote, where we have to dominate ourselves first. And so if I have a desire, or if I feel limited by my gender, then I should have the right to change it. I should have the right to mold it as I see fit. This is just playing out the Enlightenment logic to its fullest extent. Things that were not culturally appropriate or technologically feasible at that time, but are really just, downstream of this way of thinking. Western knowledge, Hallaq says, is programmatically geared to the service of power, discipline, domination, and the transformation of the world. That old adage that we have from Bacon, knowledge is power, is a lot darker than people realize. It doesn't just mean that the knowledge that you have is going to be able to empower you to get a good job and a satisfying career like people mention at commencement speeches. That's not what's going on. What it means is that knowledge is power in the sense that it can transform the world and bend it to your will. And if you read the further statements of Bacon and other mechanistic philosophers, that's literally the project that they were engaged in. They were engaged in the project of bending the world, brute matter, inert matter, nature, to their will, torturing it for its secrets, as they described. That's what they meant when they said that knowledge is power. And that's a real nice indication of the type of knowledge that they were embarking upon, that subjugating, dominating knowledge. So Said's Orientalism doesn't appreciate this, and that's Hallaq's big bone of contention, right? That thinking about things in this way is outside of Said's critique. He doesn't critique Western knowledge. He doesn't critique modern knowledge. He doesn't critique the aspects and dimensions of domination and subjugation that are inherent in the way that modern knowledge is structured. It's only misrepresentation. So what do we call it then? What do we call it? That's where it gets confused, that we were going to, if we're going to call it domination, well, there's lots of different types of domination. If we're going to call it subjugation or conquering, there's lots of types of subjugation and conquering. How do we get at the fact that modern knowledge it objectifies the material world, that it exploits, that it is extremely violent, it looks at the world as resources, and indeed, there's a structural connection to viewing nature as brute and viewing the lower races as theorized by the Enlightenment philosophers as similarly part of the landscape and similarly due to torture and domination and subjugation.
Enlightenment philosopher, people like Kant. I mean, Kant is a highly revered and respected philosopher. Everyone reads him. You know, I read him at university. Everyone likes the guy. I was never taught, it was never mentioned actually, that he wrote a great deal about race. It was a really important subject to him because he wrote about everything, not just about philosophy. And you know, his racial understanding of non-European races was very, very shocking by today's standards, perhaps in those standards of that time as well. So Enlightenment philosophers helped to systematize, organize, and justify European racism towards other races in a way which embarrasses us today, and we try and pretend it didn't happen, but it was a core part of their project. It wasn't just a leaflet they wrote. They wrote books about it, and it informed their whole worldview. So yeah, exactly. It's Enlightenment people.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's why Hallaq says it's the structure of knowledge itself, that the way of knowing nature is the same as the way of knowing people, or the way of knowing the other, and therefore it produced the same results. Genocide and ecocide are really the same thing. They are really the same action that stems from the same way of knowing the world, which is the modern, secular, violent, dominating way of knowing the world, knowing to subjugate, knowing to control, knowing to transform. And so the term that he's going to coin for this, that's going to distinguish it from every other type of knowledge that exists, is sovereign knowledge. He calls this sovereign knowledge, which is the chapter of the title, Knowledge, Power, and Sovereignty. Also, you know, apropos to his subtitle of the book, Critique of Modern Knowledge. What's the problem with modern knowledge? The problem with modern knowledge is that it is sovereign knowledge. Sovereign in the sense that there is no authority above it to rein it in, that it self-justifies. It is a knowledge that is bent on control and transformation with no limits as to what it can do. And that is what distinguishes it from pre-modern types of knowledge, including the knowledges that we have in the Islamic sciences. We don't have anything like it. There is nothing like it in the Islamic tradition, where you go and you see the types of things that they were writing. And another thing is how manifestations of this keep on coming up. Like if you go into the Tuskegee experiment and some of the medical experiments that the United States or other people have done on Black people or slaves or other, very recently, like we're talking like within, you know, living memory, people are still alive. That's not possible without the structure of modern knowledge that views Black people or subjugated races as just as much as like you would pollute a stream, right? That you have knowledge, you want to develop some sort of cure, or you want to experiment with something. You develop napalm to stick to the Vietnamese skin so that it burns longer. That they're basically your lab rats. that is modern knowledge. That you have this knowledge is meant for violence and domination and subjugation, and there's no limits. Right?
And also, I want to say, within our own Western Occidental context, in a friend of mine has adopted, talking about medical ethics, how medical ethics are framed in terms of individual autonomy, which allows, say, in the abortion debate, the dehumanization of the unborn child, even up to birth, where the calls now to, in America, Biden has done, a committed Catholic of all people, to call for this extreme form of killing, up to including partial birth abortion, it's called, and the dehumanization of the human being in the womb. Now, and disproportionately, Black women suffer from that kind of violence. So this is not just the other; it's also within. And because of our anthropology and our lack of moral values in this area, we medical ethics itself has developed this justification centered around this Enlightenment principle of the absolute moral sovereignty, the sovereignty issue of the individual. The individual has, with no transcendent reference at all. There's no metaphysical context. It's purely autonomous, and this is a very, for my view, extremely ugly civilizational turn, actually, which is having huge consequences, not just in terms of wars of aggression and occupation, but internally within our own healthcare systems as well. Very ironically.
Absolutely, no, it's a stain. It's a stain on our societies that we currently live in, and it is very emblematic, and it's very sort of symptomatic of this entire way of viewing the world. He used the perfect word, which is justification. And that is sort of, I think, sums up the way of relating to knowledge in the modern secular way, is that there's always a justification to be made, that knowledge is part of this sort of process of justifications. Whereas knowledge that is bound by moral limits that are located outside of the self, right, in a divine text, in Islamic law, by your local mufti, your local jurist, then that is something that you don't have any role in formulating justifications for what you want to do, right? That's not, it doesn't even enter into the equations. There's fail safes, there's, mechanisms to prevent that sort of thing from happening. There's a sort of, Hallaq uses the Nietzschean language of like the will to knowledge or the will to law. And these are what he's trying to get at when he uses these phrases, is that the justification is always ad hoc, right? Like whether it's to justify a certain law or a certain practice or a certain barbarity. You look at dropping the nukes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, we had to save lives. Ad hoc justification, right? We saved American lives by, that's the official history, by eviscerating, hundreds of thousands of people, close to 1 million people. It's an ad hoc justification and a certain will to violence, right? That you're basically, without any sort of clear moral limits, you're always put in this process of just sort of finding justifications for why you did the latest act of barbarity.
And also the self-justification. So people ask me, well, Paul, what do you think about X? Or what do I think about, say, gay marriage? I was asked about that. But I said, well, it doesn't really matter what I think. What does God think? That's the question. It's all referring back to my own personal ad hoc opinions, as if they matter, as if even I have a right to give opinions when this is under the jurisdiction of the creator, because he is the creator. He has the say, not me. And so this is obsession with, well, what do you think? What's your opinion about this, and this? Excuse me, it's above my pay grade. I need to refer it upstairs or refer it to the highest power before we can even think about this. And that move is never made. It's always focused on the individual autonomous person's opinion. And this is a very peculiar Western idea, of course. There's no deference to higher authority. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a very Kantian sort of attitude, and that's a great observation that you made. That everything has. And that's why it's that's also a performative act, right? Like every instance of that re-entrenches and makes stronger the default assumption that that's your decision to make, that the arena in which that decision is made is within the self, right? Which is why some of the things I advise to some of the people who move in the university space, when they go around and ask you your pronouns, you say, I do not have the right to determine my pronouns. God has determined my pronouns, right? That's a radical answer.
This is why Islam is so radical, because it points away from our we're not worthy to answer, because we are creatures. We refer to our Creator, who has the true, perfect knowledge and wisdom, which He shared in Revelation. And this is it's unanswerable, really, in terms of modernity. Modernity is kind of mute before that. Really, I mean, what do you say? Because you've simply you're not playing the game. You stepped out of the game and said, it's not me, it's God. And which God? Well, there's only one God, and he's spoken in very different ways, revelations throughout history, and it's a very powerful, radical response, really.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's very, very important. It's almost, what reminds me of is the Zionists, how they work in Congress, right? They keep Congress busy with these resolutions that are not enforceable. So, for example, something happens and they want Congress to pass a resolution voicing support for Israel, or condemning this group or that group. They don't have any enforcement mechanism. That's not the point. The point is just as a litmus test to see where people are. And now they're collecting receipts where if somebody votes against it, now they're going to target that person, right? This is very similar to, it's like smoking you out, right? Like these sorts of things about choosing your pronouns, or what are your pronouns. If you say he, him, you're done. You've already, you've reinscribed their worldview. They're meant to smoke you out, which is why I've actually, in other forums, and some people go crazy when I make this connection, but I see it and I think it's true, that there are structural similarities to Zionism and the transgender movement, that there are very interesting structural similarities, both in their aggression and in their tactics, their march for the institutions, their sort of capturing of government and certain key sort of institutions, and both in the way that they've overplayed their hands and so now have caused tremendous blowback, but also in the way in which they constantly are trying to push the envelope and smoke out opposition in order to try to cancel them or ruin them in some sort of way. Definitely not a benign tolerate me and I'll tolerate you sort of thing. No, it's I am going to proactively smoke out any opposition to me and silence and crush any opposition.
And this is some sort of bizarre non-liberal thing. This is liberalism's dark side. It flips over into tyranny, in terms of so-called wars of Bush's war on Iraq to liberate the people, but also in these ideological authoritarian moves. It's liberalism sometimes has it in its DNA to seek to crush opposition, and other times it sounds more benign, but it has this kind of Jekyll and Hyde feature about it, And at the moment we're in the Hyde or the Jekyll, I forget which is the horrible one, but anyway, we're in the one that at the moment is really trying to cause massive problems for liberalism, as in the other face. So it's all part of the same kind of a bizarre civilizational neurosis, as far as I can see.
Yes. Well, even on the left, they say "scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds," right? So I mean, that's the phrase, and it's true. Yeah.
No, it's true. It is true. I mean, liberals have always been, for me, a genocidal religion because of its justification of abortion on any grounds. Killing of unborn children in any and all circumstances is genocidal, and it's always been backed by liberalism completely.
Absolutely. Wonderful.
Anyway,
no, a wonderful welcome diversion. So Hallaq goes on and he's going to talk about two more things at least that were sort of off the radar of Said and people like him, because Said is just a type, right? Like he doesn't really have an obsession with Said. He's using Said as a heuristic to talk about a certain type of disposition in politics. One is the state. Said doesn't critique the state.
No.
And in fact, Said's a nationalist. He's a secular nationalist, and there's receipts to that we'll get into in a sec. But why the nation state? And it's important to realize that the nation state is the accumulation of the modern project of knowledge, that the way of the sovereign knowledge, as Hallaq calls it, the will to control and transform, and the knowledge used expressly in the project of controlling and transforming is most effectively executed through the nation state. The nation state as a political technology is the perfect political technology if you want to completely control and subjugate inside and out an entire population. Again, qualitatively unprecedented. We've never seen anything like it. It doesn't come close to the empires or or anything that existed, the city-states, right, of Greece or Renaissance Italy or anything. We've never seen anything like the nation state in not just, and Foucault talked a lot about the prison, school, hospital, the sites of discipline in the Foucauldian sense of disciplinary power, which is different from what Foucault called sovereign power. Sovereign power is the sort of traditional off with his head. Disciplinary power is, I'm going to change the way you think about yourself. I'm going to kill the Indian and save the man. I'm going to have Englishmen inside of the Indian's body. That is disciplinary power. Where does that come from? How is that achieved? That is only achieved through the nation state. And it's, or maybe we can say most efficiently achieved. You might have had one-offs here and there, but it is extremely, it becomes a project of the nation state, the penetration within culture, the control over institutions.
Sorry, I said for me, the biggest example I'm aware of in Europe is France itself after the French Revolution, 1789, where the French state, I mean, in the 90s, people forget, or people don't realize, in the early 19th century, there was a many different languages spoken in France. I don't mean for immigrants, I mean indigenous languages. They weren't French. Most people didn't speak French. The different cultures, I mean, I lived partly in the Basque region. They spoke Basque, obviously, and it's now called Occitanie and so on. And the French state is a unitary, centralized institution based in Paris, enforced French on everyone, and it wiped out all these differences. Regional cultures and languages were obliterated, and this is like the 19th century. And now you have a single state, which from Paris, which determines everything: law, culture, language, everything. And so this is a very striking European example. It's less extreme, I think, in the UK for all sorts of other reasons. Sure. But France is, and that became paradigmatic for people like in Turkey with the Ataturk, of course, and secularism there, and other countries, even Arab countries, have some of them anyway, have looked to France as an example in the Middle East, some countries. So it's huge, very influential globally, and it is unique. It's a very modern, unique phenomena, as you say, and very unattractive to many people, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And nation states that formed later, such as Italy, there's still a living memory. We have a phrase that the only Italians exist outside of Italy. That within Italy, people still have these local affiliations, and they're within living memory. They still speak Venetian or Sicilian or these different languages that aren't standardized Italian. A standardized Italian is sort of a World War II and after thing, right? So depending on when the modern project got going and the modern national project got going, depends or results in how far away people are from that memory, whether that memory's been entirely crushed at all, or whether it sort of survived long enough to where in Italy, there's certain sort of provinces that have some, like there's dual signage in Venice, there's Venetian signs and standard Italian signs. And there's sort of this recognition where the modern nation state project wasn't able to necessarily fully complete itself before people sort of said, hey, wait a second, it's like, we don't actually want to lose all this.
But now in France, in the region I'm in, Southwest France, there's now dual signage in Basque and French. But this concession has now been made, but it's no longer political. It's not like the Basques, are calling for independence and a political. It's not. It's just a cultural thing now. It's just about road signs. It's been detoxified. The substance of that.
It's been secularized. It's been secularized because the thing is, the same thing happens with religion, that you will be tolerated as long as you don't threaten the state or the personality of the state.
Yeah.
Right. And that if you're talking about, separatist movement, that's the most threatening thing to the nation state. That's why even the multi-ethnic sort of mixture of a nation state, if it's going to be allowed to exist at all, it has to be kept in check. Right. Like they're not going to let it get to the point where it becomes a separatist movement. That would be an existential threat to the nation state. So there's a sort of management. Now, there's two schools of thought as to how best to manage that. School of thought number one, the old school, is to crush it, right? Is that completely wipe it out. We're only going to teach.
And that's what happened after the French Revolution. They basically crushed any royalist opposition, of course, in France and other things. But that was the first way thing, and the second way was
The second way is like maybe we can tolerate a managed diversity, right, within a sort of pluralistic, or within limits pluralistic sort of nation state, and that will actually more successfully allow us to control it than if we try to crush it, right? So it becomes two different approaches, good cop, bad cop, to how the sort of the state is managed. But anything that, whether it's religion or ethnicity or anything that rises to the level of challenging the sovereignty of the nation state, nope, you're not going to last very long. Now, Hallaq goes, okay, so number one is the state. Said doesn't critique the state, which is a shame, because the state is the culmination of the logic of modern knowledge, in the way that it disciplines bodies and re-engineers subjectivities, right? You've got the dramatic examples in the Americas of the boarding schools where native people and indigenous people, their children were literally kidnapped from their homes, brought to a boarding school, taught the white man's ways, their whole culture, language, everything in a generation or two, all on life support, almost entirely wiped out, right? But this is beyond just language and culture and food and dress. This is also when it comes to individual versus collective property. They forced on the Native Americans onto reservations. They forced them to have individual lots, whereas before they owned land in commune. And so there's this sort of, even when it comes to blood representation and how much of a native are you, and do you get recognition within this federally recognized tribe, and you have to be a certain amount of blood percentage in order to do that. This is all part of the juridicality of the state and how the state manages and controls its population and forms the subjectivities, and it decides the types of subjectivities that it will allow, and then forms them in the way that it wants. So it's a very difficult, it's a huge blind spot of Said to not address nationalism, which is both ontological and epistemic, and not just sort of just a natural thing. Well, everybody needs a nation. And the second thing is the academy itself, right? Hallaq talks about the academy as a state entity. He argues, and I find it refreshing the way that Hallaq talks about the academy, even though he's embedded in the academy, because he has some very scathing critiques of it, which I find very honest and resonate with me as well, that the academy functions as a state entity. One, he has 4 points why. One, because despite all the internal bylaws, et cetera, it is a subject of the state. It gets funding from the state in whole or in part, and therefore it is subject to the law of the state. And we've seen in the last 9 months the way that that's played out. That when it comes to hauling the Ivy League presidents in front of Congress and having these witch hunts, these McCarthyist sort of interrogations or inquisitions as to what you're doing on anti-Semitism with nothing at all, assuming that pro-Palestinian activism is anti-Semitic, first of all. And second of all, not even talking about basically what they've done is they have sent a very strong message that if you want to continue to receive federal funding, you better crush these student movements. And indeed, that's what they did. They called in the police with riot gear, with full, sniper rifles and militarized, the full nine, and basically treated the student protest movement as if they were terrorists and criminals.
The enemy within. They were, yeah.
To cite a very good
the idea that legitimate protests, like during the Vietnam War, always these noble civil rights protesters in the 60s and 70s. No, they're just the enemy. Crush them.
Yeah. The Enemy Within is a great book, by the way, if people are looking for book recommendations, by Homi Bhabha. Very nice book. So despite all of this sort of pretense as to, they justify themselves, the Renaissance and the free thought, and we're the bastions of critical thinking. No. When it comes down to it, the academy is a state institution. The academy, there might be little pockets here and there where you can exercise some sort of counter whatever, but the general thrust is that these universities are state institutions and they are pulled by state strings in very concrete ways. 2 is that the academies adopt the positivism of the state, right? And by positivism, he's talking about in philosophy, he's talking about the is-ought distinction, that they teach knowledge in a way that reproduces sort of the structure of knowledge that we've been talking about this entire video. 3 is that universities, by and large, accept the state as it is. They're not engaged in sustained fundamental critique of the state as such, or is thinking beyond the state. They only think through the state in general. And 4 is that the academies, the universities, they contribute to state governance by forming the proper subjectivities that are more governable. And I have actually experienced this firsthand. You know, a lot of my cohort in my undergrad, you know, we were fairly radical. And myself and just 1 or 2 others diverted from the conveyor belt of onto master's, onto PhD, and then go, you know, be an adjunct somewhere, and then sort of go through this whole process that they go through. I kind of took a different path. Then I went to Medina and I did more traditional studies, and et cetera, et cetera. And I saw how my former classmates became less and less radical as time went on.
Really?
And I saw how they had been domesticated. And that's the word actually that Hallaq uses, and I experienced that 100%. For the majority, and this is not totalizing because there's always people who are exceptions, but in general, the university system and the academy system is a domesticating force. That the vast majority of people that go through it, maybe 90, 95% of people that go through it, it will domesticate you and give you tools. As we say, the one who has a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You will only be able to think through certain paradigms and through certain critiques and against certain critiques, and even the opposition will be somewhat managed and controlled. Whereas too much schooling, right? Like too much schooling can actually dull the intellect. Whereas many of the critiques that come outside or really challenge the state or the university system, they're not occurring within the university system, right? There's a sort of managed sort of opposition, if you will, that is allowed to function within a certain sort of sphere, even if it's begrudging at times, but it has to exist within a certain plausibility structure or not step out of certain bounds. And anyway, I have my own personal experience. I've sort of observed that. Sometimes, often, let's say, the university is a domesticating force. It's a performative force. It has a performative quality to it. It changes who you are, which is why, and this is relevant to people who are aspiring academics, and they say, you know, Tom, I want to go study this or study that, or I want to be one of the people to go in and change it from the inside, right? And what I always tell people is that you have to consider the ways in which the education is going to change you, because you're not going to be the same person that you are today after your degree. It will do work on you. Why do you think that they busy master students with reading Hegel and Kant? You can't breathe. You read Hegel and Kant and Marx. It's a domesticating act. It trains you.
To perhaps amplify what you're saying about it being a domesticating process, rendering harmless. When people like myself, when I went to university as a Christian, Orthodox, fairly traditional Christian, studying theology, one's exposure to the historical critical method, the HCM, is often a highly subversive experience, because the assumption, I didn't know this at the time, the assumptions packed into the HCM are very, very secular. They're anti-supernatural, they're anti-theistic, and there are other fascinating, like the principle of analogy and so on. They really are very toxic when it comes to any faith. And Islamically, if you go to university in the West, anywhere, I think really America, Britain, and so on, as a Muslim, a traditional Sunni Muslim, you will encounter problems because of the ruling secular liberal paradigm there that undercuts or infuses everything you study, and it will cause problems for you, not because there's any discrete facts that contradict the Islamic narrative. That's not the issue. It's the way you see reality and the way history is understood, the formation of the Quran, the Hadith, and so on, and the skepticism that's in the HCM, and a certain mindset that will subvert your faith. And Professor Lombard wrote an interesting article about this whole question of epistemology and the reigning paradigm, the hegemonic paradigm in the West, and how it affects Muslim students. But it's the same for Christian students, actually, traditional Catholics, for example. So it's not a neutral force. It really is meant to secularize and defang any kind of opposition to the system, arguably.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up the HCM, which is really understudied in our circles. Like we give a lot of attention to feminism and to liberalism, and it's due, that is required, but we haven't really we haven't hammered the HCM enough.
We need to, and Professor Lombard, his recent article, perhaps I'll put a link to the description below, is a must-read. It's forming the theoretical, conceptual understanding of how Muslims, qua Muslims, are to operate within the Western academy without having their faith destroyed. And there are very clear answers to this. And he's doing some marvelous work. Yeah, the HCM, the historical, is really key intellectual issue here, and I'm very keen to continue to discuss it and elucidate what's really about. Because the practitioners of the HCM, like Nikolai Sine at Oxford, for example, are very open about what it means. And it means you can't talk about prophecy. You can't talk about God's intervention in the world. You must treat the Quran like any other book. And this is an assumption you begin with, not a conclusion you reach. So the telephone directory and the Quran are all human literature at the end of the day. And we begin with that assumption. This is not
based on philosophical naturalism. Anything that drives history has to be a naturalistic explanation that exists within the material. It's a materialist, it's a materialist philosophy.
Absolutely. And is there anything in the HCM that is salvageable? I think there is. For example, textual criticism, study of manuscripts, say looking at the Arabic language at the time of the Prophet, or pre-Islamic. So there are areas which are, I think, not a problem at all. In fact, very beneficial for Muslims. I'm not in favour of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but there is definitely a baby and there's definitely bathwater, and we need to be clear about that, rather than simply saying, "Hey, it's just knowledge. It's just knowledge." No, Western secular knowledge. It's just objective knowledge. No, it's not. It's not. Within it, there's some good. There's a lot of bad.
Excellent. No, that's another subject that deserves a lot more attention. But that's nice.
Another time. Sorry, another time.
It's important because it's all there. I mean, the HCM and the sort of the background assumption of the HCM demonstrates what Hallaq is saying, that the universities are really about creating an intellectual machinery for government. It renders the world thinkable, in his language, in a way that is amenable to the state's interests. Right now, it's not some sort of conspiracy like people imagine, where the state's like controlling every single individual thing. I usually compare the state to a UFC referee in the octagon, right? And it's like these mixed martial arts sort of fights.
Yeah, you've lost me here with this analogy. UFC, I have no idea what you're referring to.
You ever see these guys, these mixed martial arts fights?
Yes. Okay. Sorry, I'm sure everyone else knows what you're talking about. It's just me. So ignore me and just carry on with your wonderful analogy.
Well, the point, or maybe I'll say a boxing match.
Okay. Oh, I've heard of those. Yeah.
Okay. So the referee doesn't throw any punches.
No.
But he sets the grounds for what can and can't be done inside the ring. Right. So that's how the state functions, especially in the more sophisticated, quote unquote, liberal societies, such as the UK and the US, where the state doesn't have a very obvious authoritarian presence, but its authoritarianness is very masked, right? It is all about in structuring the rules by which the games can be played, and then sort of standing back and letting different actors, whether it's the media, whether it's the academy, whether it's art and music and film, sort of do their thing. But if something steps out of that, then they have mechanisms to sort of do away with it. This is to say nothing about sort of the neoliberal takeover of the university system and how it's become sort of profit-driven, right? We could talk all day about that, but we're already running a bit late, so I probably will skip over some of that. Most universities today are more concerned about producing hedge fund managers than they are about producing moral students or individuals that are concerned with morality.
Abdul Hakim Murad at Cambridge University talk about this, the way Cambridge University, which is one of the great universities on the planet, how that has changed its whole focus, its way of operating, to a much more business-focused, money-making institution, rather than everywhere. Learning in itself. And he's very, very strong on the criticism. He's seen always been there for his entire life as an undergraduate through to being a professor at the same university.
Yes, subhanAllah. No, I had the pleasure of meeting him when I was in the UK last.
Good.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. What's funny for the viewers, maybe, you've recently been in the US and I've recently been in the UK, and we still haven't met in person.
We still haven't met. I'm so sorry. I blame your country. It's such a huge.
I blame my country as well.
I don't mean politically. You could fit the whole of the United Kingdom within Texas. I've learned. And it's just one of 50 states. So the chances of even us meeting in a million years in your country are remote.
Yeah. Well, next time, inshallah, hopefully on your territory, it'll be more likely. But yes, to say this, that yes, I remember distinctly when I was an undergrad, I lived on the border where the outgoing president was an educator, and the incoming president was a former World Bank exec. And that was the move all the universities were making, that now it was about maximizing profit, cutting costs. All of the people that, and we had strong protests against some of the policies because they would do things such as the cafeteria workers, who used to actually have a livelihood, right, a full-time livelihood. They made everyone part-time and doubled the amount of workers so that they didn't have to pay benefits. They did all these sorts of, all these sort of, tricks and things to cut costs, where the president made over $300,000 US a year. This was the model, the neoliberal model, the corporate takeover of higher ed. And we've seen in the last 9 months the vulnerability that has created, where they're so profit driven that they are now captured by Zionists and other organized groups who now dangle donations in front of them and say, if you don't crush these student protesters, I'm going to take away $50 million from your endowment.
This applies to your political parties as well, the Republican and Democrat, who are also completely dependent on donors. So if they don't do what they say, then the donors can go. So the donors are often of a particular group, shall we say, as well.
100%. If everything is about money and universities have become just about money, then they are very easily captured by moneyed interests. And indeed, they have become that way, both the political parties, politics in general, and unfortunately, the universities now. So all this to say, okay, why are we talking about it? The academy, the state, all these things, they escape Said's critique of Orientalism. Again, Orientalism for Said is just these particularly racist or bigoted scholars that are misrepresenting what's going on in the East, right? Without realizing that the entire structure of knowledge and the entire university system, even before the corporate takeover, were manufacturing the Orientalist subject. We're manufacturing the European subject that would go on to learn about the Orient in order to subjugate it and hasten and ease its colonization. That these are all the machineries to extend and transpose the sovereign knowledge of the secular West. And, okay, very good. Said never engaged the engineering aspect of Orientalism, how it shaped and how it changed subjectivities, which brings us way back to the beginning of our talk. We're talking about, the academic from Toronto critiquing the blog piece and stuff like that. You haven't taken into account how your own self has been re-engineered by the Western project of knowledge and by Western knowledges and Enlightenment values. And you can critique me for being of European descent, but if my values and principles are more aligned with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you're Palestinian, and your values are more aligned with Kant and Hegel and Marx and Locke, then I don't know what you want, right? I'll say that you're not as radical as you think you are, and you're not as you can take that and do whatever you want with it. Said did not engage with the engineering, and those who follow in Said's wake, they do not sufficiently engage with the engineering aspect of modernity or Orientalism, which is why it devolves into identity politics and, who gets to speak for Palestine and you're not a Palestinian, which is why they stick to representationalism. They also do not deal with the juridicality of the colonial project and the juridicality of modern knowledge. That the Enlightenment's responsibility for producing Orientalism, producing the legal scholars, producing the philologists, producing like the linguists, for all these people that were hastened and organized in very, very quick fashion to produce knowledge about the place that was next up for colonization. Now, there's a common sort of refrain or rebuttal that some people in anti-colonial, post-colonial, decolonial spaces have said, and I observed, as someone who was studying post-colonial theory in undergrad, I observed when this mode of critique became very common, where people will try to say, well, the people who were being subjugated, they still had agency, right? And this is sort of an attempt to preserve some sort of dignity or something like that, that they weren't just passive objects of colonization. They were negotiating their colonization. They were exerting their agency all during the time and things like that. I'm very, very happy that Hallaq addressed this type of thing, where he says that this is a mere discursive strategy to avert responsibility for those who perpetrated colonialism. That the idea of agency itself, the theory of agency itself, is an ideologically charged idea of what agency is, who are agents, what is the individual, and where is agency located, is itself something that already comes with particular ideas of will, of subjectivity, of desire, that are usually derived from Enlightenment philosophy. That we kind of use, or the people who utilize this critique usually present it in such a way as to make the domination and the colonization seem inevitable, and to make it seem predetermined, that history had to unfold in this particular way, and that this is almost like a consolation prize for those who were subjugated and dominated, which is not much of a consolation prize. We've got some quotes here. Let's see, here we go. So on Said talking about, okay, well, let me finish his critique, and then I'll get a couple quotes, and then we'll try to wrap up. So Hallaq says that, okay, if you're going to go with this sort of agency sort of rebuttal, what's a single example of this quote-unquote agency actually fighting back and stopping the assault of the colonizer? Is there a single example of such agency? And he says there is not. That the agency canard is only brought up to lessen the damningness or the charge of blood and horrific genocidal violence against the colonizer. That there is no agency except within power and after the conversion of the natives. Yes, those who were enslaved in North America, they did have certain degrees of agency that they tried to resist in both active and passive ways while they were enslaved. But that presupposes their enslavement in the first place. Mm-hmm. So there's room to talk about agency within that. But to only talk about agency, it shirks responsibility and culpability from those who perpetuated and perpetrated these acts of violence in the first place. And so this type of thing should not be jumped to. Okay. So we have some, okay. He has a quote here. So we're going to just talk a little bit about sort of the limits of Said. We're going to talk about his idea of history and the idea of history. And then we'll talk about particularly some examples of colonization in Islam. And that should do it, inshallah. Chapter 2 is very large. He says, this is on page 307 in my copy. It's footnote 135. He's quoting from Said in his book, Culture and Imperialism, where Said writes, "What I left out of Orientalism," the book Orientalism, because cultural imperialism was written after Orientalism, "was that response to Western dominance which culminated in the great movement of decolonization all across the Third World. Along with armed resistance in places as diverse as 19th century Algeria, Ireland, and Indonesia, there also went considerable efforts in cultural resistance almost everywhere. The assertions of nationalist identities." Underline that. So look at the grounds upon which Said is thinking about resistance. What is resistance in Said's method? He says, the assertions of nationalist identities, and in the political realm, the creation of associations and parties whose common goal was self-determination and national independence. Never was it the case that the imperial encounter pitted an active Western intruder against a supine or inert non-Western native. There was always some form of active resistance, and in the overwhelming majority of cases, the resistance finally won out. Now, this is Hallaq talking in the footnote. Note that Said here accepts the narrative of decolonization and deems cultural resistance as an important source along with armed struggle and a venue for decolonization. Yet, Said's notion of decolonizing modalities squarely places these modalities within the dictates of the colonizer's terms. Nationalism, assertion of nationalist identities, political parties, self-determination, and national independence, all of which are nationalist European legacies that were made in the first place to decimate the cultural traditions of the colonies and then create new realities in the image of Europe. only for these nation-based ontologies to return later in order to reassert hegemony and to further destroy many of these nation-states themselves, or at least wreak havoc in their lives. But this is not all. He keeps going. This is Hallaq talking. A little later, in the introduction of the same book, Said makes the stunning remark that, quote, Western imperialism and third world nationalism feed off each other, end quote. Are we then to conclude that Said accepts as satisfactory explanation that the agency which permitted winning against the Western intruder was the very act that inscribed the colonized in the very paradigmatic structures of the colonizers, etc.? We see here, if you could, Hallaq is not the easiest writer to read, but if you get nothing else than the fact that Said's idea of resistance was very domesticated. His idea of decolonization was very domesticated. He could only think within the paradigm of European nation states, that his idea of throwing off the colonizer and resisting the colonizer was both cultural resistance and political parties and national independence. And now that we live in 2024, and we see and we can ask, as Dr. Enes Tikriti said in one of our interviews with him, what good was the Egyptian state? What has it done for Gaza? What good is the Jordanian state? What has it done for Gaza? What good are all of the nation states of the Arabs combined that they won post-colonial, decolonial states? What have they done? What's the point if your form of resistance, quote unquote, is really the way in which the European colonizer wanted you to live, with your nation state and your independence and your type of Western values and your neoliberal economies and your everything else that comes along with it? What's the point, right? So how radical is your resistance to this colonization really in the first place? Said's resistance was not that radical. It was not that radical. He was not a radical, even though his Palestinianness gave him a strong sense of feeling of these things that were wrong and oppression. And he did many positive things. We've already highlighted them. But the terms upon which he could think about resistance was so dominated by Western ideas and Enlightenment ideas and Western thinking that he could not think in ways that actually structurally challenged those paradigms and those ways of looking at the world. If that weren't bad enough, he was very disparaging of religion, which is why it's an important thing to note for us that Said was very much a secular nationalist, which is why he's a hero of the modern secular left and the Palestinian secular left. But for those of us who are more Islamically inclined and more Islamically based, we should realize that Said had severe limitations when it comes to this, and so we should not lionize him as just this, amazing leader of some sort of revolution, right?
And these limitations are not shared by Wael Hallaq, I should say.
Not at all.
Not at all.
In ways, in more ways than people realize. So
I think there's a subtext there, but we're not going to go into that. But no.
So Hallaq says this is page 308. The next page, it's in the footnotes, footnote 137. A poignant summary of Said's problems with religion is to be found in W.J.T. Mitchell, Secular Divination. This is, I guess, an article in a larger book, pages 466 to 467. He quotes Mitchell, but it is the domain of religion that Said so often characterizes in terms of fairly reductive stereotypes. He uses the terms dogmatic, fanatical, irrational, intolerant, obsessed with mystery, obfuscation, and human helplessness in the presence of the inscrutable divine or demonic design. Mitchell cited perhaps the most damning evidence from Said's own book, Humanism and Democratic Criticism. Quote, this is Said, religious enthusiasm is perhaps the most dangerous of threats to the humanistic enterprise, since it is patently anti-secular and anti-democratic in nature. Mitchell concludes, religion for Said is an expression of the alienated capacities of the human imagination, a system of ideological deception and coercive authority. This is again in Said, Humanism and Democratic Criticism, which is edited by Aqil Bilgrami. So Said was a secular humanist, 100% through and through. He was someone who was a nationalist. He was someone who was internally colonized by Western ideas and Enlightenment values.
Wow.
Which, despite that, he managed to do quite a bit in pointing out Orientalism and the things that he wrote about. However, his investure in those values limited him significantly from doing anything to actually displace the structure of knowledge and violence and domination that conquered the entire Muslim world. And for the last 50 years has blunted and blurred our ability to truly diagnose what is at the root of this political domination, which is really a much larger structure of knowledge, and has led us down a dead end towards the secular nationalist identity politics and these sorts of very, very tame, domesticated, normal, not radical ideas for what human liberation or even Palestinian liberation should look like. Very, very far away from what we can say is a more indigenously, epistemically sovereign Islamic worldview that is at odds with the European Enlightenment worldview, something that was indigenous to us as Muslims before the domination of Muslim lands. Do you have any comment on that before we go on?
No, I think I've spoken way too much already. I'm anxious to conclude this because I don't want to. I could go on forever.
Okay.
But do you have a final conclusion?
We've got two more points, and they're not long points. Okay, so one of them is one of the things holding Said back that we've talked a little about before is his idea of history, right? We've talked about how the idea of history in the pre-modern time was a narrative of moral instruction. After modernity, it becomes encompassing all human experience. That's with the Enlightenment. If it encompasses all human experience, then this introduces this dimension of progress and development, that everything's just increasingly accumulating. That enables everything to be justified. There's a sort of infinitely justifiable nature of things if everything continues to progress. It even is an apologia for colonialism. Colonialism becomes part of that progress. Okay. You know, we'll skip here to wrap things up. It is getting close to 2 hours. So the point is that this is a structure of thought. So in part 2, okay, this is the very end of chapter 2. Hallaq gives great detail about the structure of colonial domination of the Muslim world under Western powers in the pre-modern and then flipping to the modern era. And it's very important to understand the distinction between the two. Some of the colonization of Muslim lands began before modernity actually occurred, such as especially the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Malay archipelago and other places where you have older styles of domination, extraction, subjugation, things like that. But they don't take the modern turn into the 1800s when we get the Orientalists and the sociologists and the jurists and the juridicality of Orientalism, the juridicality of the European colonial project. And he goes and gives case studies. He talks about Algeria. He talks about Indonesia. He talks about the Indian subcontinent, where just to demonstrate that this was unprecedented, that this was unique, that modern subjugation and domination, sort of sovereign knowledge, and the modern project of colonization was completely unique to anything before it. Whereas before, law was conceived of as a form of morality, now law is politics. Where we used to have a rule of law where everybody is subject to law, especially under the Sharia, now it's really the rule of a state. The state makes its own law and it decides what goes. Where there used to be a legal situation where there was no exception. There was no way to suspend the Sharia. Where now we get, after modernity, to a place where we have the Schmittian exception. You can declare martial law, you can suspend all the rules, you can do whatever you want because the state is the real sovereign. The state has replaced God. So the state is the most Eurocentric thing that we could think of, right? The state is of extremely Eurocentric technology that's meant to sort of enforce this juridicality. It was a limit of Said, and that all of the sort of legal reforms that took place in the Muslim world were acts of colonization when it comes to the breaking up of the Waqf system, right? When it comes to the a land reform or the legal reform or even the codification of Islamic law into ossified books before it used to be more grassroots and more flexible, right? These were all attempts of the European powers of statecraft, to raise a state in place of where there used to be a Sharia society and an Islamic governance, and that displaced that previous system. These things are well known, that they broke up the Waqf system, they took control of it, they started salarizing, so they put the scholars on salaries, they took control of the education systems, they standardized their curriculums, they imported both law and curriculum from the West. They controlled now the scholars because they paid their salaries. When they took over the Waqfs, they actually engaged in propaganda to tell the people, especially in Algeria, that this was a religious innovation. They sabotaged the Waqfs and the charities by making them inefficient and running them into the ground, and then pointing to them and saying, look, this doesn't work. This is why you guys are so backwards. This is why it's your religion that's holding you back. So for all the Ghadas and the secular nationalists, that say that Palestine's not a religious issue, Palestine's not a secular issue, Palestine's not an Islamic issue, this is a Zionist, you guys are basically, this is where your history starts, where you had the European colonizers destroy the Sharia society, run it into the ground, and take all the Orientalists and academics and produce literature that proved, quote unquote, that it was Islam that was responsible for you guys being backwards and subjugated, and that you really needed Westernization to redeem you. You really needed the Western state, you really needed nationalism, you really needed modern technology, you really needed industrialization, you really needed all these sorts of things. This was the big psyop that you fell for, and that people continue to fall for when they think that Palestine is not an Islamic issue, or that some sort of secular nationalism is going to save Palestine or any sort of other place in the Muslim world. That Orientalist texts were produced, and those Orientalist texts eventually led to legislation, and the legislation and the Orientalist texts were all part of the subjugation of the colonized in the Muslim world, right? And so we see how, in particular, what's funny, we'll end on this, that the particular individual that that critiqued the blog piece, I think the next day or the day after, they put something on social media about Islam is for LGBTQ, and had all these arguments, about how the Quran says this here and this there, and Islam is not queer phobic, and actually it supports queers, supports LGBTQ, all this nonsense. And the irony of ironies, Paul, is that this person is colonizing our tradition. This person is engaging in the same activity that the Orientalist scholars of England and France and elsewhere engaged in, where they rewrite, they commit epistemicide against us.
Well, they've already, that person, I think, is borrowing methodologies, tools, concepts from what's already happened to Christianity. This happened. It's now Islam's turn to be turned into a secular liberal project, just like Christianity is now largely, and Judaism is now largely, actually. Absolutely. So Islam is the last best hope of mankind, to use that expression, and so it must be taken down basically at all costs. It must be secularized, and that's what basically it's happened before, and now it's the Muslims' turn to endure this assault on our faith. Right,
but they will always attempt to conscript Muslims or Muslim-looking people in order to do it.
Yes.
And that's the rub. Is that if it were some non-Muslim academic from Harvard or Yale, we would obviously know the difference. But now we have supposed Muslims within supposedly our own ranks. In reality, they're probably not very much in our communities, that are now trying to re-educate us along the Western style, to displace what is Islam, to tell us that they understand the true Islam, that we've been misunderstanding it the whole time, and that Islam just happens to be identical to modern liberal secular sensibilities on all social issues.
I'm not pessimistic, Tom, about this. Actually, with what I've seen about Muslim youth, and so I'm not pessimistic. I don't think it's going to happen. I think it'll happen It happened in the margins. It'll nibble on the margins.
Yes.
It's already happening in the and in so-called Muslims in academia, yes. But the great bulk of the Ummah, I just don't see it happening. There's too much real faith there.
I agree.
Don't find Christianity, at least not in my limited experience. So I'm not pessimistic. The battle's real. The threat is real. But I think the outcome, inshallah, will be good. That's my intuition on this. But
yeah, no, I actually agree 100% with you.
Right.
And so these are two different archetypes. We could ask, everybody ask yourself, are you a Sa'id or are you a Hallaq? Right? Are you somebody who's
you're not two new sects now, are you? Are you a Hackist or you're a Sadist?
But how deep does your critique really go? Right? Like, are we just sort of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, or are we, really trying to do something more structural and critical here when it comes to how do we interact with the tradition, right? Are we really trying to let the tradition, like Islam, have its epistemic sovereignty and treat it on its own grounds and let it take us and shape us in the way that it is meant to shape us? Or do we take it as our plaything and we try to manipulate it and change it or shelve it or sideline? Right?
It's a good summary. Yeah.
And that's all I got.
That's okay. Well, that's my sincere apologies for dragging this on a lot longer than it should.
No. I usually prepare 1 page of notes. Today I had 2, so I knew going into it I had about double the normal amount of.
I mean, this chapter in Wael Hallaq's book is very long, so I guess that's a factor as well. But no, thank you very much, Imam Tom, for, as always, for your incredibly lucid and intelligent commentary on this astonishing individual, Wael Hallaq, who is of endless fascination, I think, and needs to be more widely read, even though he's not always very accessible. Unlike Said, as one thing I will not yield on. I will not yield when it comes, okay, he doesn't have the lyrical beauty of language expression, the literary.
That's why we're here, Paul. That's why you and I are here right now.
So I will defend Said any day over Wael Hallaq on that one issue. He writes beautifully. Unlike, I don't mean to put Wael Hallaq down. I mean, once you get used to his style, I think you can roll with it and you get used to it. But there is that difference.
Fair enough.
Okay, you can see the point on that one issue.
Oh yeah, I can see.
On his literary style. Just on that one issue. Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much indeed, Imam Tom, as always. Fantastic. And I hope people have endured to the end. I'm sure they will on a podcast while they're doing their ironing or they're jogging or they're working out in the gym, because it really is worth listening to all of what you say. So thank you very much. Until next time, inshallah.
Thank you.